Konnichiwa. Today, we're going to talk about Yori and Ho. Now, Yori and Ho are often introduced together in sentences like Meri yori sakura no hou ga kirei da. And that is a slightly verbose way of saying Sakura is prettier than Mary. I think this is an unfortunate way of introducing the two terms because it can easily give rise to confusion. It can be difficult to understand what term is doing what and how they relate to the rest of the sentence. It's much easier if we look at these two separate and independent terms, both important in its own right, separately, and then we can put them together. So let's start by looking at yori. Yori is a particle. It's not one of our logical particles, so it does not have to be attached to a noun. It can go after just about anything. A complete logical sentence, a noun, an adjective, a verb, whatever we want. Its basic physical meaning is from. When we send a letter, we may say Sakura yori, from Sakura. And abstract words all have their base in physical metaphors, even if we sometimes forget the physical metaphor. And with words like this, it's useful to begin by understanding the original literal meaning and then see how the metaphor works. So yori means from, and we already have another word meaning from, don't we? And that's kara. Now there is a difference between the two, which is particularly pronounced as we start to apply them metaphorically. Kara marks the A in A from B in such a way that it is treating A as the starting point or point of origin. So, if I say, Nihon kara kimashita, I'm saying I came or come from Japan. Japan is my point of origin. And this in a way is midway between the literal physical meaning and the metaphorical meaning, because it can mean literally I just came on a plane from Japan, or it can imply that I'm Japanese or that I was raised in Japan or something like that. When we move to its purely metaphorical meaning, it usually means because. In other words, A is the point of origin of B. Samui kara komoto o kiru, because it's cold and when it's cold. From the fact that it's cold, I am wearing a coat. Now, yori means from in a very different sense. The directional metaphor is concentrating not on the origin of A from B, but in the distance or difference of A from B. So, if we say, Sakura wa Meri yori kirei da, we're saying that from Mary, Sakura is pretty. What we mean by this is that distinguished from Mary, Sakura is pretty. Now it does have something in common with Kara because we're still using Mary as the base point, the point of comparison. And because of this, because it has a comparative, meaning we are not saying Sakura is pretty but Mary isn't. We're saying that taking Mary as the point of comparison, Sakura is pretty, therefore more pretty, prettier, in comparison to Mary. Doing some Mary, Sakura is pretty. And you notice here that we said just what that first sentence, Meri yori Sakura no hou ga kirei da, was saying, and we didn't need ho. It works perfectly well to say exactly the same thing without that ho. And we use yori in other contexts. For example, we may say, Kotoshi no fuyu wa itsu no yori samui, which literally means comparing from always this year's winter is cold, Or this year's winter is colder than always. And what that actually means is this year's winter is colder than usual, colder than most other years. So that always is a kind of hyperbole in a way. Similarly, we can say Sakura wa hito yori kashikoi. Sakura is clever compared to people. And what that means again is Sakura is clever compared to most people. Sakura is clever compared to people in general. In other words, is cleverer than the average person. Alright, so now let's look at ho. Ho is quite different. It's not a particle, it's a noun. That's why we have no ho. And its literal meaning is a direction or a side. And when we say side, we mean side in the sense of direction, not in the sense of edge. So, for example, if we talk about two sides of a field with ho, we're not meaning the two edges of the field. We're meaning that we divide it approximately in half when we talk about the left side and the right side on the field. Now, as we see from this analogy, one side always implies the other side. And that's the important thing about ho in its metaphorical uses. In its literal use, when I'm cycling in Japan, I might say to a stranger, pointing the direction I'm going in, それは、その町の方向ですか? And that's saying, is that the direction of Honmachi? I'm not asking for street directions, which I can't understand in English or Japanese or any other language. I'm asking for the literal direction. Is Honmachi that way? Or am I going in the opposite direction? Which I often am, because I'm hoko onchi, which means I have no sense of direction. So when we apply it metaphorically, we mean one thing or circumstance or whatever as opposed to another. We can put it after a noun with no, as we do with Sakura, Sakura no ho. Or we can put it after a verb or an adjective, in which case that verb or adjective is describing the ho, telling us what kind of a ho it is, which side it is. So, if you say to me, Mary ga kirei da to omou, do you think Rai is pretty? And I reply, Sakura no hou ga kirei da. I'm saying the side of Sakura is pretty. In other words, I think Sakura is prettier. Once again, it's a comparative construction, so I'm not saying Sakura is pretty and Mary isn't, but I am saying that the side of Sakura is prettier than the other side, which is Mary. And once again, let's notice that we don't ruin yori here. Sakura no hou ga kirei, that works perfectly happy on its own to mean exactly the same thing. And a lot of the time, you're going to see either yori or no hou on their own. We do sometimes use the two together, and when we're doing that, we are either speaking fairly formally, or we are really trying to underline the point of the difference and comparison between the two. Another case in which we say ho is in the expression ippo, which means one side. And we can see this often used in narrative, sometimes right at the beginning of a sentence, not just a sentence, but a paragraph, and indeed a whole section of the story. And what it's doing when we do this is it's saying essentially what we mean in English when we say meanwhile. But we shouldn't say that ippo means meanwhile, because it doesn't. Meanwhile is a time expression. It's saying at the same time. Ippo, while performing the same function, does it quite differently. What we say when we say ippo before going into something else is really referring back to what we were talking about before, whatever that was. And we're saying all that was one side, and now we're going to look at the other side. It's like demo, which wraps up whatever it was went before with de, Nechespe, Tefhomo, Desu, all that was, all that existed. Via gives us the contrasting conjunction demo, but. And we've talked about that in a different 20-year lesson, haven't we? Ippo should probably, strictly speaking, be ippo de. However, because it's a common expression, as is often the case with common expressions, we are allowed to drop that component. So, if we say, Lad King Koopa, that's Bowser, was completing his preparations for the wedding ceremony with Princess Peach, and then we say, Ippo. Mario's jumping up blocks on his way to rescue the princess. So on the one side, that's what's happening with Bowser in Bowser Castle. On the other side, this is what's happening with Mario in the Mushroom Kingdom. We can also use Ippo as a conjunction. And essentially, this is working just the same way as the Ippo, which means meanwhile, it's taking one side and then the other side. So it's a contrastive conjunction. So we might say, Kono atari wa shizuka na ippo de furuben. It's quiet around here, but it's inconvenient. On the one hand, it's quiet around here, but it's inconvenient. Literally, that kono atari wa shizuka na, which of course is shizuka da in its connective form, this area is quiet, and all that is a descriptor for ippo, shizuka na ippo. One side is that around here is quiet. So we're describing the one side, the ippo de, and then de, that's the copula. One side is that it's quiet, and the other side is, but we don't actually say but the other side is, that's already implied. One side is that it's quiet, it's inconvenient, and that ippo de acts as the conjunction. And we can, once again, leave off the top to here. One other use of ippo that we should mention is that it can also be used after a complete verbal clause to show that something that is happening is continuing in one direction. For example, we might say, Kono mura no jinkou ga heru ippo de. This religious population is just declining and declining. It just goes on declining. Kono mura no jinkou ga heru means this religious population is declining. And the ippo is telling us that it just continues on in that one direction. It never grows. It never stays still. It just declines and declines. If you have any questions or comments, please put them in the comments below and I will answer as usual. I'd like to thank my Gold Kokeshi patrons who make these videos possible, and all my patrons and supporters on Patreon and everywhere. And I'd like to thank you for attending this lesson. Korekara mo yoroshiku onegai shimasu. Class dismissed.